We're about to do my favorite thing of all. When I first spoke to people at the Lannan Foundation, the idea behind readings and conversations was that many a time people attend readings and go home as confused as they were when they came. And the idea was to talk about the work that they had just heard read, with the idea that you'd go home with a book and be able to read it and think about it further in ways perhaps that you hadn't thought of it before. In this particular case, I'm as bewildered as I hope all of you are. And I want to start by expressing that bewilderment. Now, I assume that when we come to part 3 of this essay on theft, threat, excuse me, we're meant to be silenced by a kind of confusion. This wasn't made to be a solution. Yes?
Yes.
And I've never seen you write before using the circumstances of mystery or of suspense or of thrillers, and yet, I don't know about all of you, I was riveted both when reading and when hearing you read. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, what kind of ending do you think the ending is? What is accuracy?
We were talking earlier, Michael and I, about a piece that's in the book Float, that's a new piece, that's an essay on translation, and in the format of an academic paper, except that at the last paragraph, where in an academic paper, the speaker says, and now to sum up, and then gives you a handy paraphrase of everything he's just said, so you didn't really have to sit through it. You could just come for the final paragraph. I've never been good at that, and as I said in that essay, I don't know how to sum up. And I do think that the best thing you can do in that place of summing up is to blast it open somehow, perhaps with small means, like swimming, but just to, I don't know what the word is, defuse the presumption that one can have thoughts alive in your mind, in a room, and then get a little nugget of summary of that and take it home and have it. I don't like that, having the thought. I like to be in the thought and then it goes away with the time. So I think that the accuracy is simply an abstract thing that can be introduced to make the story go out of reach.
I love it. I mean, endings are so boring when they satisfy the conditions that have been prepared for them.
Yeah.
And when you ask in this piece, what does an answer answer? And how does an answer affix to the question?
Yes.
It affixes like a stocking that has been taken off, but still the blood stain remains.
Yes.
What an astounding preparation for us to feel in some very vital way bereft.
That's a good mood to end on, I think. I mean, not for us to end on tonight, but for an effort of thinking to end on.
I was fascinated because you mentioned the stairways that are there without your remembering putting them there. And it reminds me of something that see, everyone is stupid until they get smarter. And I used to, when I started out, ask Anne rather stupid questions. And I said, well, how did you link Simonides with Gertrude Stein? And she said, those were just both books on my desk. I wanted to see what connected them. And that is the method here too. These characters do not exist. This story is not a story. This man-woman doesn't study bloodstains or know about them. There are no talking crows. The whole thing... Oh, yeah, wait a minute, Michael. But the whole thing is the making of something that the eye and ear hear and feel great need, our need for answers, our need to understand is perhaps the need that we're most punished for in human life. When we accept our inability to understand, you name it, grief, what have you, we start to feel a little bit better, a little bit less Aristotelian, huh?
Or you can take that a step further, letting go of the presumption of an answer or a tidy paraphrase. Then you can go on to think, well, what do I do with my mind, my time in this room instead? Something exhilarating, like just travel with it. That's what the reason why the answering is so frustrating to me, is that it makes the thinking stop. And the whole purpose of being together with other people in a room is to have thinking move somewhere. I mean, that is when you feel most alive in your life, when your thinking moves. When your thinking is still, watching TV or whatever, thinking the same thing you've always thought, you might as well be dead. I mean, it is a deadness. And living happens when your thought moves. And I think it's not that hard to have that happen, but you have to, as you say, relinquish some kind of complacency about answering stuff. Yeah.
I'm going to have to get the tape to this conversation because I love these answers. There's a distinction then to be made between James Joyce on the one hand and Samuel Beckett, who was once his secretary, on the other. Joyce felt that if you could amass enough information, you could have Dublin within the pages of a book.
Yeah.
And Beckett felt if you could subtract enough information, you could have something much more exciting, nothing.
Okay.
And I think that there are writers on the side of the something and writers on the side of the nothing, and now writers like you who are trying to examine, to put the something and the nothing next to one another.
I think that's true, or at least throw them into a vacuum tube where they move around That reminds me, this is not in any way relevant to what you're saying, but the other day on the internet, do you ever read Wikipedia, and it's full of the most enlightening typos? And there was, I think it was an essay about Beckett actually, the phrase, death is indeed nothingless. Nothingless, one word. They'd misspelled nothingness. But this death is indeed nothingless is so perfect a summary of everything in Beckett, you don't need to read the rest. Death is indeed nothingless. However, I interrupted you. What were we?
Do you have... Well, you're going to out-lovely me at every turn. Do you have any explanation? Because you quote George Eliot in this piece, and George Eliot is the person that people refer to when they're talking in particular about realism. George Eliot and Anthony Trollope. In fact, they gang up together and they call Dickens Mr. Popular Sentiment. They launched a campaign. But I'm curious, because realism seems like a protracted seance that literature fell into. And like fighting your way out of a bag, we seem only now, maybe, to be escaping our need for its comforts.
Huh, you don't think I'm a realist?
Excuse me?
You don't think I'm a realist? You don't think I'm a realist?
I think that you enact ceremonies of realism.
That's nice. I like that.
Without it being realism exactly. I think realism would bore you if you had to write it.
Well, yeah, I get, but see, yeah. I think, though, that there isn't any difference. There's, I mean, George Eliot, Trollope, what I'm trying to do. It's all, you know, John Cage has this saying somewhere, looking closely helps. That's all it is, in a different framework. So I have a little tiny screen in my head. George Eliot had a huge screen. Trollope had like 5 heads worth of screens. But looking at whatever shows up on the screen as closely as possible is all you can do to make a true piece of writing. And that seems to me the essence of realism. It isn't maybe about the color of the shoelaces that everybody had in the room, but it is about whatever is actually on your screen.
Yes. Yes. And yet,
That's okay.
do you know this book? This is a book that the people at New Directions published with, for, by, and Carson. It's a vast accordion. And the accordion is a translation of a poem by Catullus, the translation examined minutely because the Catullus translation is about a death of his brother. And this is your occasion to examine the death of your brother. And accompanying the translation, we're not talking about something small. We're talking about thrilling collage upon collage. And when Anne and Curry and I did a show together, I played the sound of this book opening on the radio because it is part of the book.
You can actually, if you have one at home, take it to the second floor of your house and drop it over the staircase, and it will go 2 floors down, and it makes a terrific unfurling sound. It's not that bad for the book.
And it was made, I think, to realistically examine if anything could help. In it, you speak to the woman who you did not know who your brother was living with at the time of his death. Mm-hmm. She answers questions in a very surprising and difficult way to take, because she tells you things about your brother that you hadn't known. And I think the whole process of making something whose shape you didn't know before you started.
Mm-hmm. True.
Who knows where it began? Did it begin with the brother's death or with the Catullus poem? At any rate, the examiner of this will not know. You can come away feeling that something has happened. You have a book called Grief Lessons, its translation. And after I read this book, my father had recently died, and I took a poem in Hebrew, an alphabetical poem that begins with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, and I did what Anne had done because it felt like grief lessons. It felt like maybe there is something about art that heals human sorrow, and that we have to hope there is, because art has always expressed human sorrow, and who would know more about that than someone who can read the Iliad in Greek?
Right. Well, it was, maybe I should explain, people probably don't know this book, the strange situation. My brother disappeared in 1979 and showed up again in the year 2000 on a telephone. He called me out of the blue, and we had a conversation of a strange nature. And it turned out that he had been living in Copenhagen for 15 years and had a wife and a whole life there. Anyway, I arranged with him to, a month later, visit Copenhagen and meet up with him again. And I bought a ticket after I hung up the phone. And a week later, I got a call that he had died. So there was no meeting, but I went and met his widow and his dog. And then, well, let me say, my brother was a mystery to me when he was alive and equally when he was dead. So after I came back from Copenhagen that time, I decided to make a book to contain that mystery. So I bought an empty book and put things on each page that were about him, photos and little paintings and language. And then on the left side of the book, I analyzed, as Michael says, a poem of Catullus, word by word. So the two sides of the page kind of interact in a way. The word on the left-hand side evokes what happens on the right-hand side of the page in a way. But I wouldn't say that it gets anywhere as an explanation of who he was or who I was doing this with his life and death. But going through that process changed the whole situation somehow. I can't say how. I mean, Michael says it helped him when his father died, and I think that's true of other people who've spoken to me, but I don't really understand any of why that works or what it's about, or what it is really to sort of package grief in a book. You know, it's kind of a barbaric thing to do, but. On the other hand, I love the book. So there we are.
Well, in my favorite at this time pamphlet and float, which is called Variations on the Right to Remain Silent, there's a section, well, there are many sections, and in this, it's once again a demonstration of Van Carson's belief in stacks, which is the title of another pamphlet. But there's notes. It begins with a bit about the mysterious drug that Ulysses is given to avoid being turned into a pig by, how do you say it, Kirky?
Circe.
And then there's material about Joan of Arc, there's material about Francis Bacon, there's material about the poet Hölderlin. And the gifted connection, the structure of constructing staircases between these things has become, to my mind, more and more impressive over the time that you've been working. And so you say about Francis Bacon that what people call the violence of his work is not what Bacon calls the violence of his work. An interviewer is going on about the violence of the work, and Bacon is interested in the violence of the paint, and in the paint's ability not to depict violence, but to be the essence of violence. And therefore, the interviewer at one point points to a splotch of white paint on a canvas, and he said, I was so sick of it, I threw it at the canvas, and then I decided to leave it there. And that is the violence of that paint. To hear, I think, in serious, what does that word mean, serious? But at any rate, in real writing, the writing is what's doing the work. The writing is not about something. It is something. It might be a structure of unanswerable questions, or the question, can I deal with my brother's death? Or any number of other unlikely things. But this is the question art asks reality, and reality has no questions to ask, it seems to me, in return, that art is the asker of the question.
And reality, I think art is something to occupy your mind while you put up with reality. Reality goes on. You need to be doing something while reality goes on in its way. And thinking is, as I've said perhaps too much here, thinking is what I prefer to be doing. Writing is the product of thinking. But more and more, as you say, this is very insightful, the staircase thing, more and more what I do in order to think is just take 5 things. It could be the 5 books on my desk, or 5 words at random, or 5 tasks somebody gives me, and try to make the mind move from one to the other. Just the connection is where the thinking happens, and the connection, that movement of connection is where it's suddenly exhilarating. It's suddenly, well, that's what the immortality of poetry means. It doesn't mean you live on after death. It means there are moments of time in your life where you forget time. You are immortal if you forget time. I think language can do that for us. But it has to be in that moving mode, not stuck in thesis, antithesis, summary.
Also, in Float, there's a pamphlet called Uncle Falling, yes? Two very autobiographical sections about a childhood in Canada, northern Canada,
Very.
and hay and cold and silence. And you say in the second part about your father that although you never had a long conversation in your lives, that you liked each other fine, that you joked with one another, that on a 2-hour drive to your wedding, your first wedding, he asked you, "Do you think this fellow will stick with you?" And you answered, "Yes." And that was the entire conversation in the 2-hour drive.
We drove on.
Now, you describe both of you as tight-lipped
Yeah.
and a bit remote. And what I notice that's an astonishment in your writing, any time I read a sentence of yours, I see that there are 2 or 3 words that an ordinary person would put there that don't need to be there and they're missing. And that the sentences are themselves tight-lipped. And that here is a writer who might otherwise, as you said, be thought of as romantic, but the extraordinary strictness with which you remove unnecessary gesture makes the writing spare and I would say doubly moving.
Well, bingo. I think that would be the best I could do, if I could do that. Because I've tried, somebody said, Curry reminded me of this the other day. Somebody was talking to me about writing and said that the good thing I did in my writing was to have every word resist the next word or resist the way it should go. And I believe that's accurate enough. It's partly orneriness, but it's partly trying to make the words take you to a fresh place. And in that essay that Michael is talking about, half it's about my father, half it's about my father's uncle, Harry, who was a deaf hermit. He lived all alone in the northern woods of Canada all his life, and he was deaf, so he didn't talk much. And I think all of our, the resistingness of all our family comes from the example of Uncle Harry. He was just a noble, unique person, but he used, 5 or 6 sentences in his life. But he used them well. It's an example.
That's where we stop. I want to thank you enormously for the deep straightforwardness of your answers. And I want to pardon me for saying that I love you and I love your work. And it's been a real privilege to be on stage facing you for this amount of time. Thank you.
Thank you.